The events leading to school integration in King George County, Virginia, were a significant part of the national struggle for civil rights. Despite having unsettled the community while advancing the cause of both local and national black education, two pivotal court cases are seldom remembered today. For 2 decades, the black community of King George and its NAACP attorneys bravely fought the local school board for equal educational opportunities for their children. The first victory in court came in 1948 and resulted in the opening of the Ralph Bunche High School, whose facilities were comparable to those of the local white school. The community triumphed again in 1968 with the full integration of the King George County school system. Today, the Ralph Bunche Alumni Association advocates for turning the former school building into a vibrant community center and museum. This new function would address existing social needs and, equally important, memorialize the school's historical significance. In 1892, Homer Plessy, a black man, refused to move from a whites-only train car of the East Louisiana Railroad. After Plessy's arrest for civil disobedience, his lawyer argued that the racial segregation of cars violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. With only one dissenting vote, on May 18, 1896, in the landmark case Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities did not breach the Constitution as long as they were equal. This decision enabled the passage of extensive discriminatory laws that relegated blacks to second-class citizenship. Named after a black character in minstrel shows, Jim Crow laws mandated the establishment of separate accommodations for blacks, usually of inferior quality to those for whites. The racial order became manifest in the white-only and colored signs in buses, trains, restaurants, restrooms, theaters, and most public spaces across the South. Newspapers reported on Jim Crow laws at national, state, and city levels, each having their specific and sometimes overlapping priorities. National attention focused mainly on interstate transportation. Segregation of transportation and public education, as well as the regulation of interracial marriage, were state-level concerns. Local segregationists' interests stretched from libraries, hospitals, and pool rooms to cemeteries and schools for the blind. During the 1890s, white lawmakers began curtailing African Americans' voting rights as well. New disenfranchisement laws circumvented the 15th Amendment's prohibition of racial discrimination against voters. Such tactics included the grandfather clause, literacy tests, and poll taxes. A poll tax receipt like this one from Alabama served as an admission ticket to the polling place. A product of the late Jim Crow era, the Negro Motorist's Green Book promised black travelers an embarrassment-free experience. This guide provided state-by-state listings of hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, doctors, and other businesses that welcomed black patrons. Defeating the user's expectations at times, the guide led tourists to segregated accommodations. As tools of Jim Crow laws, segregation signs directed blacks to their own separate but equal facilities. In reality, these signs prohibited African Americans access to white-operated beauty parlors, swimming pools, restaurants, stores, hotels, and other public accommodations. At the same time, because numerous black communities lacked such resources, residents simply did without them or traveled long distances to attend black-owned establishments. Founded in 1909 to fight against the segregation and discrimination of black people, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, led the legal attack against separate but equal facilities. Spearheading these efforts was a new generation of lawyers formed under the mentorship of Charles H. Houston at Howard University Law School. Beginning in the 1930s, they designed a long-term strategy for undermining the separate but equal doctrine. Their plan aimed first at challenging the education system and forcing states to create equal facilities for black students. With the legal precedent set, the next goal would be full school integration, along with the overturn of Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Howard University started in 1867 as a school for black clergymen and quickly became a renowned institution of higher learning for black students. At a time when most African American schools offered only vocational training, Howard University provided degrees in education, journalism, medicine, law, commerce, music, and other disciplines. Numerous prominent leaders of the civil rights movement were Howard alumni. Charles H. Houston was the architect of the civil rights movement. A professor at Howard Law School, he mentored a new generation of lawyers whose systematic efforts undermined the legal principles of segregation. Houston believed that lawyers were social engineers who understood the Constitution and knew how to explore its uses in the solving of problems of local communities and in bettering conditions of the underprivileged citizens. In the early 1940s, Oliver H. Hill, Martin A. Martin, and Spotswood W. Robinson partnered in the Hill, Martin, and Robinson law firm in Richmond. Together, they became the leading national experts in school inequality suits. As NAACP members, they would work with local PTA organizations on identifying black schools to provide the basis for suits, as well as potential plaintiffs. Most of their early cases led to salary equalization for black teachers and equal school facilities for black students. The end of World War II energized the NAACP's efforts to end segregation. As black soldiers returned home to find that their service did not earn their equality, they joined the NAACP in large numbers. The desegregation of the armed forces in 1948 solidified even more the stage for starting the civil rights movement. Contemporary NAACP posters called black citizens to unite and finish the fight for equal rights. Thurgood Marshall, a Howard Law School graduate, succeeded his mentor, Charles H. Houston, as the head lawyer for the NAACP. In 1940, he established the organization's Legal Defense and Education Fund to offer legal assistance to impoverished black citizens and communities. While the Legal Defense and Education Fund soon became the legal arm of the civil rights movement, Marshall tirelessly counseled its attorneys and oversaw numerous cases personally. In 1967, he became the first African American justice of the Supreme Court. While the Plessy versus Ferguson decision created the separate but equal doctrine, the equality of public facilities, including schools, was seldom achieved as the NAACP lawyers began challenging this inequality in courts. A few residents of King George County courageously sued the local school board in 1946. The premise of Civil Action 631 was black schools' inferior construction, equipment and facilities, instructional personnel, libraries, and transportation services compared to their white counterparts. Civil rights attorneys Oliver H. Hill, Martin A. Martin, and Spotswood W. Robinson III of Richmond, Virginia, masterfully won the litigation despite the King George School Board's fierce opposition. In July 1948, U.S. District Judge Sterling Hutchinson determined that the defendants had unlawfully discriminated against Negro school children. This decision led to the opening of the Ralph Bunche High School on September 2, 1949. King George residents still remember Lambs Creek School on Whitehall Road as one of the several one-room black schools in the county. All grades shared the same space and competed for the attention of a single teacher. Older boys would fuel wood-burning stoves and carry buckets of water from outside wells. desks and supplies never sufficed, and books were always hand-me-downs. Court documents indicate that the value of local white school buildings and sites, including the King George County High School, shown here, was $236,000 in 1944. At the same time, the worth of blacks' school properties amounted to $18,000. Estimated at $12,000, white schools' furniture and equipment were valued at 4 times that of their black counterparts. The black high school was not accredited, and black teachers earned about 25% less than their white colleagues. In 1946, Margaret Smith and the other King George County plaintiffs in Civil Action 631 filed suit against the local school board and its longtime superintendent, T. Benton Gale. In trial testimonies and press interviews, he frequently cited existing laws and the Virginia Constitution to defend the school system. However, statements such as, and I quote, "buildings alone do not make up an effective school," speak of his personal feelings toward the cause of equality. In July 1948, Civil Action 631 concluded with the federal district court ordering the school board to equalize black and white school facilities. The board's measures were meager, to say the least, under the pretext that the time left until the beginning of the school year was too short. One such action consisted of improving the Edge Hill Training School library with used books or inappropriate topics or books in foreign languages. In September 1948, after the school board failed to equalize black and white school facilities, black students' lawyers continued to press for change. Assisted by attorney Martin A. Martin and NAACP State Secretary Lester Banks, 12 black students sought admittance to the white King George High School. After reading Section 140 of the Virginia Constitution, which stated, white and black students should not be taught in the same school, Superintendent Gale denied the students admission. Black resistance to the board's avoidance of real school equalization and fears of potential requests for the actual integration of schools led county authorities to a new plan. King George County residents were called to vote on a bond issue for the construction of a new high school for black students. On November 7, 1948, the measure passed by 322 to 245. Ralph Bunche High School opened less than 1 year later. The 1948 court order that restrained the school board of King George County from discriminating against black children heralded a new era for local African American education. Funded through a $150,000 bond voted by county residents, Ralph Bunche High School opened in September 1949. A far cry from the existing Edge Hill Training School, the new building featured multiple classrooms, a library, a gymnasium, and other amenities, including a heating system and indoor bathrooms, a staff of college-trained teachers, and a curriculum equal to that of the local white high school allowed a new generation of black students to earn accredited diplomas. Ralph Bunche High School shortly became a focal point for the local African American community. The first accredited black high school in King George County took the name of diplomat Ralph J. Bunche. A Howard University graduate, Bunche achieved international fame for his successful armistice negotiation that ended the Arab-Israeli War in 1947. By winning the Nobel Peace Prize 3 years later, Dr. Bunche became the first African American recipient in the history of the award. Bunche's motto, "Segregation and democracy are incompatible," drove his involvement in the civil rights movement. Ralph Bunche High School started as an accredited institution, That, like its white counterpart, included grades 9 through 12. The new building shared the same location with the former Edge Hill Training School, which, after renovation, became the Ralph Bunche Elementary School. The curriculum expanded with courses in sciences, arts, foreign languages, and business. Ralph Bunche High School accomplished more than just classroom education. Apart from the rigorous academic curriculum, students enjoyed a variety of extracurricular activities, from sports and theater to music and arts. Teachers, students, and parents came together for school events, bonding with each other and strengthening the Black community of King George County. Today, most alumni name Ralph Bunche High School, along with their church and family, as the three main factors that shaped their upbringing. The proud, smiling faces in this 1968 yearbook represent the last class to graduate from Ralph Bunche High School. Many alumni continued their education, receiving undergraduate and graduate degrees, and embarking on impressive careers in business, social work, the military, and education. Their high school diplomas were the passport to a new world of opportunities that had seemed unattainable to their parents and grandparents. The last class motto was, "They conquer who believe they can." In 1952, the Supreme Court began hearings on several cases on school desegregation in Kansas, Virginia, Delaware, South Carolina, and the District of Columbia. Consolidated under the name Brown versus the Board of Education, these cases gave the NAACP lawyers the foundation for the final attack on segregation. Their legal, historical, and psychological evidence led to a favorable judgment on behalf of the plaintiffs. At the end of the deliberations, Chief Justice Earl Warren announced, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." On December 7, 1953, large crowds of African Americans gathered outside the Supreme Court to hear the second round of arguments for Brown versus the Board of Education. Limited public seating led to long lines that wrapped around the block. The case grabbed the nation's attention, and it was well understood that the court's decision would be monumental, no matter the outcome. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional. A year later, the court mandated that public schools integrate with all deliberate speed, allowing school districts to proceed at their own pace. The decision's ambiguous language gave opponents of desegregation the grounds to avoid compliance with the law. The state of Virginia adopted a massive resistance strategy that perpetuated school segregation for a few more years. In 1964, 38 Black students in King George County sued the school board once again, demanding full school integration. Following this case, as well as the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the King George Consolidated High School opened to students of all races in 1968. The strategy of plaintiffs' lawyers in Brown versus the Board of Education relied on evidence presented to the court by psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark. Their doll test involved Black children between the ages of 3 and 7 years, who were shown plastic dolls identical in every aspect except for their color. Most of the subjects attributed positive characteristics to the white dolls, thus allowing the Clarks to conclude that prejudice, discrimination, and segregation had a negative psychological impact on Black children. The deliberate speed mentioned in the Brown versus the Board of Education decision gave white supremacists the grounds to resist integration and sparked a mass movement to end racism in all aspects of life. Sit-ins, boycotts, marches, and other forms of nonviolent resistance became the new strategy of African American leaders. Despite creating crises, it enabled the dialogue between activists and officials and gradually strengthened the former's positions. This photo shows Jereen Mercer, a protester in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Virginia's massive resistance to the Brown versus the Board of Education decision energized the Black community in King George County once again. A 1962 letter addressed to Superintendent T. Benton Gale and the local school board preceded Civil Action 3579. Plaintiffs attacked the Freedom of Choice Plan, which granted Black students the right to request enrollment in white schools, but also gave pupil placement boards room to use selection criteria that disguised racial segregation. A year later, the judge restrained the defendants from using racially discriminatory criteria in the assignment of pupils to public schools. In September 1967, the King George News referred to the planned King George Consolidated High School as being representative of new schools being built in the Old Dominion. The facility boasted air conditioning, flexible classrooms, closed-circuit television, and a gym and auditorium, which doubled as after-hours meeting spaces. For the first time in the history of the county, Black and white students would share real, equal education. As King George High School opened to Black and white students in 1968, the Ralph Bunche High School building began a slow and steady decline. At first an elementary and secondary school, it then housed administrative offices and storage spaces before closing down completely. Prolonged neglect and decay fueled talks in the late 1990s on its impending demolition. These prospects energized the Ralph Bunche Alumni Association, which succeeded in adding the school to the National Register of Historic Places in 2006. Today, the support of the King George County Board and the local residents could turn the former Ralph Bunche High School into a center serving the community through exhibition spaces, offices, and meeting rooms. This would recognize and uphold the building's historical significance as a symbol of the struggle for justice and equality. Between 1949 and 1968, 19 senior classes graduated from the Ralph Bunche High School. About 135 of all graduates continue to support their alma mater as members of the Ralph Bunche Alumni Association. In 2004, the Historical Preservation of Ralph Bunche School proclamation rallied the alumni community behind the cause of bringing recognition to the educational and historical significance of the school. All presidents and boards continuously diversified the Ralph Bunche Alumni Association's portfolio of activities. Initiatives such as the Academic Scholarship Award and the annual picnic have become new traditions. Dinner dances, galas, cruises, and group participation at local events also successfully bonded members. However, all undertakings support the association's ultimate goal of raising public awareness that Ralph Bunche High School must be preserved. Currently, 15 properties in King George County are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Among these, the Ralph Bunche High School is the only 20th century structure and also the only one directly related to the history of the local African American community. The building of the Ralph Bunche High School features the work of two architects. Samuel N. Mayo planned the original 1949 structure, and John J. Ballantine, Jr. was responsible for the 1957 edition, which included classrooms, a kitchen, and a cafeteria. Ballantine's drawings serve as a reminder of the generous existing space that, if renovated, can successfully meet the demands of the community center. The conversion of schools into community centers is a business model that has been successfully applied elsewhere in Virginia. The John J. Wright Educational and Cultural Center in Spotsylvania, which also functions in the former John J. Wright Consolidated School. This facility houses a museum and a library while offering educational services to pre-K-12 students in Spotsylvania County. The former Armstead-Tasker-Johnson High School in Montrose opened in 2007 as a museum and space for community meetings. On May 26, 2015, King George Supervisor Ruby Brabo honored residents who were plaintiffs in the 1946 and 1962 court cases that eventually led to integration of schools with a Heroes Among Us ceremony. As she heard the names called of residents who sued the school board to get an equal education for their children, Brabo said she hadn't realized that people she knows were responsible for making such a difference in history. For those deceased plaintiffs, descendants, and other family members were recognized in their honor.